Serious, outdoor enthusiasts of Reddit, what is the creepiest experience you had in the great outdoors, paranormal or not? I was outside checking on some turtles that were hibernating a few miles into the woods. As I'm finishing checking on the last turtle, I hear this growl and the entire woods goes quiet. I stand there for a second listening and I can hear something moving through the woods behind me to my left. I get up, grab my walking stick and pull out my knife and start walking slowly to my truck. As I walk, I can hear it walking behind me slowly, working its way kind of to my side where I can see that it's a huge wild dog. I get within about 100 feet of my truck when I hear it starting to run through the leaves. I turned around screaming as loud as I can, swinging my walking stick, and it runs in the other direction but stops and watches me a few yards away. I keep walking to my car and it keeps following me. Right as I get close to my truck, I hit the alarm button on the key and the wild dog runs off and I run to my car. While I drove out, I could see the dog in my rearview mirror following me, so I hit the gas to get out of there. Feral dogs are actually a problem near me as well. There is a kill order on them because feral dogs tend to kill other animals and attack people indiscriminately. The sad thing is they all likely at some point had been people's pets until they got lost and went feral. I went camping with a friend of mine one 4th of July weekend. We were just friends, as she had a BF, so she slept in her car with her dog. Wasn't a huge fan of sleeping in tents, and I slept in my tent. Night goes fine. I sleep pretty well. The front of my tent was facing her car, and the rear of my tent was facing the woods. In the morning, as the sun was rising, I hear footsteps out of the backside of my tent and feel hair fur rubbing against my tent. It's amazing how much you can hear in the middle of the woods away from roads and cities. Unfortunately, the back of my tent was facing west, so no shadows. I figured, oh, she probably let her dog out and he wants in. So I opened the front of my tent toward her car, and immediately my stomach dropped. In her car I see her dog, Black Lab, staring outside the window, paws on the dashboard, growling, with his hair standing on end. So many things ran through my mind at once. Oh crap, WTF is behind me. I don't want to get eaten. So I just sat there, staring at the dog, who is staring at whatever is behind me. It was one of those moments where everything goes silent and all you hear is your heartbeat. You feel it in your hands and you strain your ears to try to hear what you think is going to eat you. Eventually I built up the courage to clear my throat loudly, and I think whatever it was ran away. I never knew what it was, but it scared the crap out of me. A few minutes later my friend let the dog out of the car and I grabbed it so it didn't chase whatever it was behind me. Dog just wanted to cuddle anyway. I did have my gun and bear spray, but it's not like I was going to leave my tent to apply it to whatever massive animal was behind my tent. And no food inside the tent. We left it in the cars. Probably a black bear, curious enough to approach a human campsite, but would be scared off by enough loud noise. Finding deer at night is always a pretty big jump scare. Half the time they don't even notice you until you get close, and then a group of 200-pound dark silhouettes all start running away like holy crap. Human and I freeze up like holy crap. Bigfoot. I've started singing or playing music whenever I'm walking in the dark, so they hear me before I'm less than 10 feet from them. I lived off campus, and walking home some nights from my pal's house on campus you could hear a lot of rustling on my street. Deer in the woods on side of the road watching you. And sometimes when I was cocked I would whistle real loud and you would hear an army of deer crap their pants and book it into the woods. When I was about 10, my father and my little brother and I went camping at a nearby site. My mom didn't want to go because she was 5 months pregnant and she didn't want to be hot and uncomfortable in a tent. Sometime that night we heard a sound like a baby crying. My dad said it was a cat, but it went on and on. The next morning dad got us set up fishing and he walked to a phone. When he came back we had to pack up and leave immediately. We later found out my mom had a miscarriage last night. For years it haunted me that was the baby we heard crying. Foxes sound a lot like crying babies too. When I was younger my best friend and I would explore the farms and forests around our houses. He had divorced parents who lived away from town, so we had 3 big ole areas full of things to find. Once, we went farther than typical and hiked up the side of a deep ravine we typically used as a boundary, coming across a dilapidated house. It was so cool, it having been just out of our typical zone. and we decided to explore it. We hung out there, carefully avoiding the loose boards and massive holes, going through both floors and the basement. Right before we were going to leave we heard an engine, and from a window on the second floor we see an ATV driving around in the field around the house, loaded down with guns. This armed fellow starts patrolling the area a bit, looking carrying one of his rifles. We could have probably just walked out and explained in retrospect, but at the time we were horrified of what he may do. We waited a bit and carefully crawled through the field before making a break for the trees and sprinting home. Middle school me about had a heart attack over this unexplained, heavily armed dude searching for something. I have 2 stories, both of which are dumb. First off, I was paddleboarding in a lonely section of a lake with rundown cabins everywhere. No one else was there, so there was no noise to distract me, which let my mind wander, inevitably, to the depths below. Around that time, I got confused and lost my exit. I paddled hopelessly for about 15 minutes, later realizing I was in the wrong place, all the while thinking about the horrors of the deep. It was just then, when I sat down to sort out my location, that something bumped the board. I got the heck out of there. Second one is from an overnight school trip we had in the Rocky Mountains. We were all sleeping in bed when I woke up because I had to pee. Around 2 AM, I noticed something was off right away. Turns out, what I thought was a bear was right outside our tent, snorting and sniffing all over the place. I became petrified with fear, since I was the closest one to it, and didn't move for what felt like an hour but was probably more along the lines of 10 or 20 minutes. Nothing happened, and I later found out that it had been an elk, but during that time, I was more scared than I had ever been before. Honestly, elk are scary too. An elk is big and will kick your butt if you pee it off. Reposting from a previous comment. TLDR. My brother and I saw letters spelling help float to the surface a lake and then sink back down. Long form. While I was growing up, my family would visit the same lake every year for a week every summer. As we got older, we would visit a large rock we called the cliffs, and jump off. The rock was only 15 feet tall at the highest point, but the water was really deep. When we got older, we would jump in and try to touch the bottom, but we never could. When my brother and I were in our teens we took kayaks out to the cliffs to jump on our own. We jumped off several times, and when we got too cold we took a break on the top of the cliffs to warm up in the sun. As we were sitting there, we noticed a white shape in the water, floating towards the surface. It was a letter, H. Eventually it sank back into the water and we lost sight of it. Before we could look away or say anything, another shape was floating upwards. It was the letter E. Eventually, it too sank below, but it was soon followed by 2 more letters, L and P. We didn't jump in after that. We stood up and left without saying a word. We never mentioned it to anyone, and I forgot it even happened after a while. Several years ago I was working as a camp counselor and I told this story as a ghost story. I had forgotten about it, and I texted my brother to see if I hadn't just made it up completely. I asked him if he remembered the time we went to the jumping cliffs alone and saw something in the water. He replied yes, that he did remember. I asked him what it was and his reply was, letters. They spelled help. I've posted this one before but here it goes. I have a grandma and grandpa who go out on long fishing hunting trips. First day they go out, don't get anything at all, camp out in a tent. Middle of the night, grandma wakes up and swears she hears what sounds like somebody walking around the tent and knocking on it. She wakes up husband, but he tells her to sleep. Later on that night, he's the one who wakes up and now he's hearing things. But he claims he's hearing what sounds like whispering. He stays up until sunrise, wakes up his wife and they continue their trip. As the day ends, they have a couple of squirrels and contemplate just going home. Grandma insists on just going home after last night, but husband wants to stay one more night to go fishing in the morning. The compromise is that they sleep in the back of their truck since they have a shell, sleeping mats and sleeping bags. That night neither of them can fall asleep. Both doze off here and there but ultimately they're still a bit shook from the previous night. A few hours go by and suddenly they both hear what sounds like tapping against the car. The tapping goes around, almost like somebody is circling the car. They're terrified at this point. Obviously they're out in the middle of nowhere so they don't have signal and they're trapped in the back of their truck. They simply wait it out. The tapping goes on and off for what they claim to be hours. They said that at some points, the car would even be shaken back and forth, and that they would hear what sounded like talking. Finally, after what seemed to be ages, it stops. They wait about 30 minutes and nothing happens. They immediately bolt out and drive home. Needless to say, they don't ever go on trips like that on their own anymore. I'm laying in bed, pretty creeped out, and my husband cleared his throat right when I read the tapping on the truck part. I almost pee myself. Going night hiking with 2 other friends when we were all around 14 or 15 years old. Some advice: night hiking might sound fun, and it can be, but it is so not worth it. We were on a legit, fairly well lit trail that we'd all been running on many times before and knew very well. The trail ran along a river on one side and a pretty sparse forest on the other. We were being pretty loud and laughing, so it scared the crap out of me and my friend when the other friend suddenly spun around on the spot and said, "What was that?" We were startled for a second and then thought he was just trying to frick with us and told him not to do it again. Then he was like, No, seriously. I heard footsteps like someone was literally right behind us." Again, we were a little bit nervous for a second, but then brushed it off and kept walking. Maybe 10 seconds later though, we all heard it again. There were definite steps crunching the gravel behind us. We all kind of slowed down and then the steps turned into a running sound and we turned around to see a guy running off into the forest. We noped the frick out of there so fast, oh my god. We were all on the high school cross country team and I'm pretty sure all 3 of us ran PR 5Ks that night. Gave myself goosebumps remembering this just now. Sometimes people can be scary. Family camping trip to prepare my little brother for his first Boy Scout trip. First night went well. Second night about 1 o'clock I wake up to this sound right outside the tent. Heavy footsteps. I glance at my dad and lil bro but both are sound asleep. I'm 12 years old and instead of waking my dad up I just roll back over and pretend not to be awake. Footsteps just keep going but never fading away, like something was just continually walking around the tent. After what felt like hours of me crying silently while scared shitless, the footsteps just slowly go back to the forest. From what I could tell, our tent was backed up to the woods and the campsite. I relax a little and I don't know how but I managed to fall back asleep until morning. I wake up to my dad unzipping the tent and saying a few choice words from surprise. There was a headless deer laying in front of our tent flap. It looked perfectly fine body-wise except for the missing head. Sounds kinda like someone or something didn't want you there. When I was in high school, me and a buddy went camping where I have hunted since I was a kid. We took off later in the evening and got up right at dusk. Shot some guns, made dinner and started a fire. We were the only car up the dirt road. We decided to go to bed around 11, so we spread the fire out with a shovel. Around midnight we woke up and noticed our fire was going again, so we both got up to put it out and found a lady sitting around the fire, not 10 feet from our tent. We freaked out and told her to leave. She just walked down a ravine that leads to private property. After that we proceeded to take out all the guns we brought and try to get some sleep. Weirdest night I've ever had up there. I went to a private elementary school that took the 4th 6th graders on a week-long trip to the Olympic Peninsula every year. Normally we do these in early spring, but I guess due to scheduling issues we went in October one year. A very nice ELC with cabins and whatnot, and we had a ton of fun every time being minimally supervised out in the woods. A part of this whole thing involved a night hike where we'd take red flashlights and try to spot nighttime wildlife or listen for owls and bats and things like that. Well, the night we were out doing this, a massive wind and lightning storm hits. We got spared the torrential downpour until we got back, but our counselor, in all his infinite hippie wisdom, decides it's a great time for us to experience the dark forest in all its glory. So we're put into pairs and seated under trees around this big field. Don't get me started on why that was an awful idea in a lightning storm, and told to turn off our lights and just sit quietly. The next closest pair of kids was maybe 20 yards away. We're sitting there in near pitch darkness listening to the trees creak ominously in the tall grass in the field whipping about, and suddenly the field is lit up by lightning, and there's a man just casually strolling by. Not our counselor, not any of the adults with us. He didn't have a backpack, or a light, or anything that would indicate he was a camper or backpacker. A rumble of thunder and flash of lightning later and he's a bit further on in the field, but has stopped all movement. A minute or two later the field lights up again and he is just booking it into the cover of the trees. Our counselor collected us pretty quickly and hustled us back to camp after that. It's possible it could have been one of the wildmen we have living in the rainforest, but the camp was a good 70-80 miles from where they normally like to live. Definitely not super creepy like some of the stories here, but still very scary for a group of 9-11-year-olds out in the woods at night. Avid bushwalker here, living in rural Australia. One early summer afternoon, I was bushwalking down a big ass hill, which has a river down at the bottom. From the peak of the hill to the base is about 500 meters. However, the track sort of snakes in a back and forth S-like shape, as it is too steep of a hill to just go straight down. About 1/3 of the way down, I spotted a pair of feet, from about the ankles down, sticking out between some bushes, with the feet running perpendicular to the track. As I got closer, I could see that a man was laying down there, and based on his body position, assumed he was just resting, and likely homeless and or disoriented, seeking shade from the summer sun. Further adding to my theory that he was homeless, he had long hair, a long beard, and was wearing track pants. It was 35+ degrees Celsius. As I got about 100 meters from where I saw the man, and was now on a section of the track running parallel and below to where he was, now walking in the opposite direction. I'd followed a curve on the track's track. I saw that this man was suddenly running down the track. Seeing this unnerved me, as based on his outfit he didn't appear to be a local jogger. As fight or flight began to kick in, I pulled out my inhaler, took a puff, and pretended that I too was about to start jogging. I wanted to commit to my act in case I had judged him wrong, and he really was a local jogger, albeit a poorly dressed one. Full stop. He continued to run after me along the track, and as I was about 2/3 of the way down, I noticed that he was running too hard to merely be a jogger. He was running closer to a sprinting pace than a jog, which as most people know, is a terrible idea when running downhill, let alone in 35+ degree heat, in track pants and with node. As he gained ground on me, I decided to sit on my ass and slide down the hill, between sections of the track that ran parallel to one another. Once I finally made it to the bottom and across to the other side of the river, I turned and saw that he had stopped running. I continued to walk along the river, when after about 5 steps I heard him yell out, "You fricking S." I continued to run on and off until I made it back to the nearest road, and am yet to return to this track. TLDR. Got chased by a man who was laying in the bushes while I was solo bushwalking, who called me a fricking S when I outran him. The track sort of snakes in a back and forth S-like shape, as it is too steep of a hill to just go straight down. This is called a switchback. Your story is creepy as frick though. Waking up to gunshots on our specific area. Some campers camped lower than us and thought shooting live trees would be fun. I found them, ripped them a new one for trashing the federal park, then called the ranger. New gun owners are freaking dimwits. Yeah, I've heard shots while hiking before. Didn't want to investigate. No point in getting in a gun battle with rednecks. And I agree, new gun owners tend to do dumb crap. When I was in the Cub Scouts, we would occasionally take camping trips in the great outdoors. Since we were all 9 at the time, the adults did all of the work and we just ran around having a good time. However, one camping trip, we had all settled in for bed, and since I forgot my mat, I had to sleep on the hard floor so I didn't fall asleep right away. It was around 11 at night and I could still hear some of the adults talking by the fire when all of a sudden I hear what sounds to be a mix of a wolf lion. All of a sudden the entire camp gets quiet and the only noise is the crackling fire. After the loud roar, one of the adults ran to his tent to grab his sidearm. He then told the other adults that he would check it out. After about 30 minutes he comes back running and panting, saying that we have to go. So at around 12 AM, all of the adults and kids pack up camp and we book it. It's been 9 years and I still don't know what made that gut-wrenching sound, nor do I want to know. I once was out hunting for meat on an African farm. I was in a little stone shack miles away from the nearest house, waiting for hours for an animal to come. At some point I heard something crawling and sniffing behind me. I assumed it was a jackal or cheetah or something and was scared as heck. Turns out our hunting dog followed my tracks for over 40 minutes because he wanted to join me. Next thing he did was to lay in the waterhole because he nearly killed himself by running so long in the heat. One of the creepiest, funniest experience I had during my time working there. Poor dog. Last year I was working on my bachelor's thesis for my biology degree. The thesis was about the breeding behavior of the European nightjar, Caprimulgus europaeus. So naturally it included a lot of field work, and since the European nightjar is most active during dusk, the field work mostly took place during that time. So this one night I'm out in the forest with a fellow student searching for breeding locations like we had been doing almost every night for most of the summer. Apart from the occasional encounter with an ill-tempered hunter or a particularly protective nightjar, these nights were mostly uneventful, but not that night. As we were walking down a little track through the forest on our way back to our cars, we suddenly hear this enormous rumbling sound coming from deep inside the forest, like a giant was waking up from his nap and had some severe bowel issues. We looked at each other in confusion, trying to figure out what this damned sound was, when we could hear it was coming closer to us. Still without any clue what the source of the sound could be, we both started running down the track to get the heck away from whatever monster was making it. Then while running we look behind us and see a pack of 10-20 wild boars that came storming out of the forest to cross the track at the exact place where we had been standing a couple of seconds earlier. Right now I appreciate it as a pretty amazing encounter, but at that moment I was creeped the heck out. I also realize we were really lucky to get out of that situation without a scratch. For those who don't know, wild boars will frick a brother up. Ask Robert Baratheon. Upvote you shoots. One time we were riding ATVs around on the mountains near our hunting cabin. It was just getting dark, so we were heading home on an old logging trail miles deep in the Pennsylvania wilderness. All of a sudden we saw headlights coming in on our adjoining trail that were much too big for ATVs. We quickly turned off our headlights, pulled off the trail deep enough into the woods where we wouldn't be seen, and killed the engines. We knew the guy who owned the property and he gave us permission to ride there, but not any others as far as we knew, so coming across someone else seemed unlikely. We hadn't before. The path the truck took led to a gate. One guy got out, and thanks to the truck's interior lights we could see 3 other men with firearms. The one who got out checked the gate but had no luck getting through. He went back to the truck, grabbed a pair of bolt cutters, and cut the lock so they could pass through. From there we waited until the truck was out of sight and bolted down the mountain as fast as we could. When we got back to our cabin, we called the owner and he said no one should have been up there, so he'd check it out. The whole situation was sketchy at best. Our guess is that they were poachers, as we knew the area quite well and had never seen any suspicious landmarks that would denote illegal activity. For example, pot fields. It still creeps me out thinking about what would have happened had we been seen. Chances are you were seen. As someone who's experienced with trail riding in the mountains, a light from a single ATV piercing the darkness can be seen from miles away, let alone multiple ATVs. Those guys probably thought you weren't going to mess with them. I have gone on a yearly spring turkey hunting trip for the past 7 years. Couldn't go this past year due to joining the military. Around my 3rd year in, my dad and I left to go fishing one day, leaving my dad's best friend and his father-in-law back at camp. When we returned there was another fellow back at camp. Not really all that uncommon as we camp right along the Appalachian Trail. Well, we got back and figured that they had made a friend. I sit at the campfire with the guy and the father-in-law while my dad and his best friend go get firewood. Now we're a friendly group and this guy wants to make camp. We politely say no and that there isn't any room at our spot. He leaves and goes to make camp right down the road where there are more spots. When my dad and his best friend get back, they load up all the guns and call the state troopers. I get handed a gun and am told to be wary. Not sure of what is going on, I just comply until I am told the story. It turns out the guy was a wanted murderer, self-admitted, who had hiked the trail all the way up to New England with virtually no gear. When asked about if he was carrying a weapon, he trailed off and didn't give a full answer. When I was out fishing, the guy said he needed to change and dropped Tro in front of the 2 that stayed behind. That was the first time in the 25 plus years the trip had been going on that any of the guns were loaded at the campsite. I was mushroom foraging for hen of the woods mushrooms. I don't know how I did it, but I had snuck up on a 10-point buck. Yes, I was close enough to count. The buck was eating a patch of fly amanita mushrooms, which are totally fun to eat, but he ate the entire patch while I watched in amazement and horror. He finished eating the patch and looked at me strangely, then stumbled off like a drunken man. I had kept watching till he disappeared into the brush. Then I kept walking farther into the park. For about a mile or so, I started hearing high-pitched yips commonly associated with coyotes. It sounded like a pack of 6, which would totally try to put me on their food chain. I backed out of the woods I was in and drew my mushroom knife out, which was a well-worn Leatherman pocket knife. In Idaho I heard the pack following me for the entire mile or so back when normal people would hike. I'll never forget the look that deer gave me, or the sounds of the coyotes, but dang, I wish I got those mushrooms. My old man is a pretty straight shooter and doesn't really say much unless it needs to be said, and on that note he told me this story and I tend to believe him. Early bow season in NH. Septoct, and he's in his stand about 4 PM when he catches movement out of the corner of his eye. There's lots of old logging roads where we hunt and MT bikers take full advantage of them, so he wasn't too surprised when he saw this guy, but something was off about him. As my dad watched, this guy came more into plain sight and he could see this guy from about the knees up, and he's dressed in older style clothes, maybe from the 60s or older. Anyway, he swears this guy was floating, so to speak, never turned his head, arms not moving and neither were his legs, just gliding down the trail. Now my old man figures he's sliding in mud or maybe ice, but when the guy started heading uphill in the same manner, he got the heck out of there. Visiting my aunt in rural New Hampshire. She lived about halfway down the U on a dirt road that was U-shaped and joined back at the main road. I get out to pick up the mail and tell her I'll walk down to the house, maybe a quarter mile. I have her dog on the leash. We are inside the U and walking downhill. The whole section is on a hill with a little lake at the bottom. We keep walking down. After a bit, I realize we've walked a bit longer than a quarter mile and the woods are a bit thicker than I remember. We keep walking and now I'm heading uphill. After scrambling up a bit of a hill, I see a farmhouse. It's the farmhouse on the main paved road and it's outside the U. Weird, somehow, while hiking down, mostly, and to the right, inside the U we've ended up outside the U and up a hill. I don't want to cross the farmhouse land because my dog isn't very friendly and I don't know what dogs they have. So I head back down the hill and follow a little ridgelet back to the dirt road, exactly opposite where I went into the forest, inside the U. Just in case you didn't think I could navigate, I can. Rationally I must have just spaced out crossing a berm, a little ditch, a dirt road, a pretty substantial dirt road, another ditch, and another little berm to get on the opposite side of the U, but it sure felt like I'd been kidnapped by those Rip Van Winkle type green men. White mountains are spooky, man. Ooh, I have one for this. Boyfriend and I were doing a road trip around Scotland last year. We were sleeping in the car during the nights and would get up, pack up everything and head somewhere else the next day. One night we stayed in this gorgeous bay right by the sea. Beautiful sunset. Lots of other campers. It was ideal. We liked it so much and wanted to hang around the area a bit longer, so the next night we stayed in the same bay. However, when we got back to the bay to set up camp for the night, there was no one else there. Bit weird, but whatever. No big deal. It was late when we arrived and already starting to get a bit dark, and my boyfriend started cooking dinner. As he was doing so, I decided to take some rubbish over to the bins about 100 feet away. Got to the bins and suddenly heard this weird hissing sound at the top of the cliffs next to us. It just kept going on and on up there, then stopped. So I thought it might just be owls. They do weird crap like that, right? Then I heard it again, only this time, it was coming down the cliff to my level, and it was approaching me. I shone the torch round but couldn't see anything, so I legged it back to the car and told my boyfriend. He sort of shrugged and carried on cooking, then suddenly stopped. He looked off down to where I heard the noise for a moment, then started packing the car. I asked him what was going on, but he just said to keep packing up quickly. We got the car all packed up and were just preparing to leave when headlights came from down the lane. A police van drove past, towards the end of the bay, then looped back and left again. No idea what that was about. Either way, we left that bay and found somewhere more populated to stay. When I asked my boyfriend why he'd wanted to leave so quickly, he said he had heard the exact same thing I had. The hissing from up the cliffs, descending to our level and approaching. getting louder. Noped right out of that place the very next morning. I'm not an outdoor enthusiast, but I live very close to some woods. There's nothing very spectacular about these woods. However, one night, I was sleeping in my bed, and I heard what I could only describe as a wacky laugh. Think crusty, but more realistic, if you can hear what I'm describing. It was weird. I never checked out my window and fell asleep not long after, but the noise creeped me out big time. I haven't heard it since and have rationalized it to have been a fox. My mind was going nuts though. If I ever hear it again, I'll refer to this post and try to snap a pic of whatever it was. Hopefully a fox. Sounds more like sleep paralysis tbh. Once as I was falling asleep I started having a dream before being entirely asleep, and there was a narrator in it. Crap scared me back awake. Not exactly scary at the moment, but it was later when we realized what happened. My family had just gotten an outdoor deep fryer and decided to bring it along to our cabin in the great northern Maine woods. We deep fried a turkey, and not knowing the precise amounts of oil, it overflowed slightly. Later that night while sitting inside the cabin we all suddenly got hit by this intensely disgusting odor. It smelled like crap, garbage, and death all rolled up into one. Nobody had any clue what it was and it faded away after about 30 minutes, so we chalked it up to randomness and forgot about it. The next morning when we went outside we found rather large paw prints, and the area where the grease had spilled was all torn up. Turns out, unbeknownst to us at the time, a rather large black bear had been less than 15 feet from the window of our cabin while we sat there innocently wondering what smelled so bad. Glad nobody went outside to look. Poor stinky bear. It's a bit strong to call this creepy, but it's happened on 3 separate occasions and I've never known what I'm hearing. In each case I've been camping in close proximity to a lake, but each time a very different lake hundreds of miles away. I'll be sleeping and it will be well past dark and suddenly I'll be awake or be awoken by a single very heavy splash. There's absolutely no sound prior, just suddenly a huge kerplop. And it's no fish jumping. Fish jumping kind of splat when they land. There's no way they have enough weight to make the kind of deep plop I heard. The sound is like someone had taken a stone the size of a volleyball and dropped it from about 4 feet off the surface. And there's no sound afterwards either, of any kind. Each time it's such an isolated audio event, it's like it was happening by design in a Foley studio or something, needing a perfect clean plop take. And it's really the plop I remember hearing, more than the splash, because of the weight of it. As a kid who has thrown lots of rocks into lakes, you get a sense of what weight makes what sound. This was heavy. I've heard that sound while camping near water. I tell myself it's just beavers. A few years ago me and a buddy of mine decided it would be a good idea to go camp in the bed of his truck. The spot we planned on staying at was basically just a big circle surrounded by nothing but woods. I could add a satellite pic to better explain if I need to, down a long dead-end gravel road near where we grew up at. After driving to said spot and setting everything up, we sat down and decided to break out the beer and our guitars. Not 20 or so minutes after, we both seemed to notice a wild butt scent that I can only describe as blood. I say we both noticed it because as soon as it hit me I asked him if he picked up on it too and he instantly confirmed. Before this I had that weird feeling like I was being watched but just shrugged it off and kept drinking playing. Ultimately the smell alone was enough to get us to pack up and leave. I have been back to the spot multiple times since this happened and everything has been normal. I have no idea what me and my friend experienced, or if we even experienced anything. The only logical thing I can think of is there was a dead animal near us, but we didn't stick around to investigate, so there's no real way to know. I will never forget that feeling of being watched though. It has happened since, but nowhere near as bad as it was at night. Okay, so I was traveling, this is in Australia for context, and I was at this campsite about 20 minutes past a small town and had gotten there about an hour-ish after dark. Now I was the only person there, and when I called the off-site caretaker to book, he said that since it was just me that I could use the day shelter kitchen. So instead of setting up my tent in the dark, I decided to drag my sleeping bag inside where I had some actual light. Hours later I realized I required something from my car, so I drag open the sliding door, and this wasn't a small door, it was one of those big loud ones like you would see on a barn. I was looking out into the darkness as there was no lights or moon, just the glow from the lights behind me. Now in case you have never been in a situation like this, the light reaches about 10 meters and then has about 1 meter where it drops off into nothingness. And in this small patch I saw 4 legs. These were not just normal legs, they were like those of a dog and long like human leg length long, and they were bright white and stretched up to where they should connect to the body of the animal, but there was nothing there. Then it began to move. The legs walked. They walked in parallel to the building, making sure that they remained in that grey corridor, then disappeared into the darkness. I decided that I didn't really need to get whatever it was from my car and slept barricaded in the tiny office. To this day I don't know what they were, and I have looked into it, nor do I know how long they were there before I saw it. But I do know that that thing was smart enough to know how humans see and where the grey corridor was from my viewpoint. Very creepy. My cousin and I were goofing off in the woods on my aunt and uncle's land when I was about 12, shooting things with our pellet guns, exploring, etc. His dog Bogey, pit mastiff mix, was wandering around as well doing his own thing when we hear a super loud whistle. Think like a whistle people do at sporting events or when your dad needs to get your attention. Bogey yelps a loud whimper and bolts back to the house. We're right behind him running as fast as we can. We never found out what it was. We assumed someone was trespassing on my aunt and uncle's 40 acres, maybe growing pot or something. We didn't care to find out. It's the Whistlers. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.